They never wanted you to hear this story. Not because it's unbelievable, but because it's uncomfortably true. In 1745, buried in the blood-soaked pages of early colonial America, a name was almost erased, not by time, but by force. A boy no older than 13 who orchestrated the deaths of over 200 men, soldiers, mercenaries, and even civilians. A boy who wasn't caught because he was never hiding, he was protected. Worshipped, feared, and for a brief, horrifying moment in history, he played God. His name was Elijah Brant. No birth certificate. No grave. Just whispers in a Massachusetts military ledger. And a sealed church journal labeled, Divine Retribution, 1745. You've been told America's foundation was built on revolution and freedom. But what they don't teach you is that its true architects weren't just rebels, they were cultists, occultists, strategists of the soul. And Elijah, he was their prodigy. At 10, he was found in a collapsed cathedral in New France, the only survivor, surrounded by 32 mutilated bodies in a perfect circle, each corpse missing their eyes and tongues. He was smiling, and when questioned in Latin by a Jesuit priest, he responded in perfect Akkadian, the language of the gods. By 12, he was being escorted by high-ranking Puritan warlords through underground meetings across Boston and Salem. His guardians, they claimed. But to the right eyes, they were something else entirely. Templars in exile, carriers of a flame older than Scripture. At 13, Elijah devised what would later be called the Blood Psalm strategy, a war tactic so precise in its psychological and spiritual devastation, it turned seasoned Mohawk warriors into blubbering husks within 3 nights. No bullets fired, no armies raised. Just whispers in the woods, symbols carved into the bark, and dreams that made men jump into rivers and never surface. But here's the part that will haunt you. Every tactical decision he made matched the prophecies from the sealed Dead Sea Scroll, the fragment they never released, not even to scholars. And the question becomes, was Elijah the author of these horrors, or just their vessel? Because if a 13-year-old boy could bring down 3 malicious and reshape colonial law with ink and fear alone, then who's really pulling the strings today? You're not supposed to ask that, but you just did. Welcome to the descent. The reply? I see the veil. Twice in the comments when the time comes. You'll know when. They called it the Crypt of St. Mercy. A church basement, stonewalled and shadow-drenched, buried beneath the snow, heavy forests of northern Massachusetts. It was supposed to be a place of prayer, sanctuary, but the floor was too smooth, too clean, too deliberate. Beneath the altar there was no wine, no bread, only chalk markings, circles within circles, inscribed with dead languages, clawed into the stone by hand, symbols that predated Christianity by thousands of years. And in the center a child's bed. That's where Elijah Brant was raised. Not by priests, by keepers. Historians mislabel them as ascetics or hermit monks. But their robes weren't Christian. They were stitched with pine resin and bone thread. Their tongues were split. Their eyes tattooed black. They believed the world ran on 3 forces: blood, memory, and sound. And Elijah was the child of all 3. He never saw sunlight for the first 10 years of his life. Instead, they fed him myths, not the ones in books, but the ones hidden behind the books. Stories older than Genesis, older than Sumer, older than thought. They said the world had been created and destroyed 6 times, each era erased by its own ruling class. Not by bombs, but by secrecy. They trained him to listen, really listen. Not to words, but to the vibrations beneath them. How a lie resonates. How fear leaves an echo. How truth disappears like a breath in cold air. Every night, he was made to sit inside the inner circle. 49 stones, each etched with a sin America hadn't committed yet. One by one, they made him recite counter prayers, inverted psalms, things no child should know, things no man should know. And when he got them right, something moved in the shadows. Something listened back. The keepers recorded the sessions in what they called the Reverse Bible, a bound collection of every unholy utterance Elijah made while in trance. That book was later seized by a hidden branch of colonial military intelligence and buried under Fort Knox. But one page surfaced. It reads, "The boy is no longer just a boy. He is history incarnate, not the record, the rewrite." Understand what that means. Elijah wasn't trained to worship. He was trained to invert, to make men see angels and demons and call their own chains liberty. That's not just manipulation. That's America's first psychological weapon. What makes a man obey without question? Not force, not money, not even fear. It's belief. Twisted. That's what the Blood Psalm strategy was. Elijah's masterpiece, not a military maneuver, not a physical attack, a spiritual invasion. And it began with music. 3 notes, played on a reed flute made from the femur of a dead priest. Soft, simple, repeated in precise frequencies during the new moon. That sound was never meant for the ears of the living. It was written to unravel memory, to make men forget why they were fighting and who they were fighting for. That's what happened in Fort Crawley, a bastion of 128 colonial soldiers, well-fed, well-trained, battle-hardened. They held a strategic choke point between the French and Mohawk lines, untouchable, until the sound began. For 3 nights, the soldiers reported nightmares, visions of bleeding statues, weeping pine trees, and children speaking backward Latin. By dawn on the 4th day, not a single man remained sane. One carved the word, Satuel, into his own chest with a bayonet. Another crucified himself upside down. And the rest walked into the river, pockets filled with stones. Not one shot was fired. No enemy was seen. And on the northern ridge, witnesses say they saw a boy, standing alone, watching, writing something in a leather book. The report was dismissed, labeled mass hysteria. The soldiers were said to have died of exposure, disease, or madness from isolation. But a letter, intercepted, then sealed, tells a different story. The boy recited the psalm in reverse, and the wind turned. I felt my own blood slow. My hands forgot how to grip the musket. I could feel my mother's voice in my ear, telling me to sleep. I wanted to obey. I still do. That letter was written by Lieutenant Alden Graves. He hung himself 2 days later. His final words, scrawled on the barrack wall, "The war is not with men, it's with meaning itself." That's the part you must understand. Elijah didn't kill with weapons. He killed with thoughts. And once you learn how to shape a man's thoughts, you never need to fire a bullet again. This wasn't war. It was conditioning. And America learned it from a child. Ask yourself this. How do you erase a man without touching his body? How do you unmake a soldier, a father, a brother, until all that remains is a shell who doesn't remember his own name? That was Elijah Brant's second gift, cognitive deletion. A process so clean, so undetectable, even modern psychologists refuse to acknowledge its possibility. But it happened, again and again, and it began with mirrors. In the aftermath of the Fort Crawley event, a pattern emerged. Survivors, those who didn't drown or claw their own eyes out, reported a phenomenon no one could explain. They couldn't recognize their reflections. They knew they were looking at themselves, but they didn't feel it. One man, Private H. Dowry, wrote in his journal, "Every time I look in the mirror, I see my eyes move half a second too late. It's like the man in the glass is waiting, and I'm not sure I'm the real one anymore." Within a month, Dowry was institutionalized. Within 2, he was gone. No records, no grave. This was the next phase of Elijah's tactic, stripping identity through symbolic resonance. The boy had discovered that names, uniforms, even thoughts, could be reversed if you could fracture a man's memory of himself, and it wasn't random. Each victim had handled the same artifact. A coin, stamped not with a president's face, but a serpent swallowing its own tail, and one word etched in Proto-Sumerian beneath it, Zurak. That word doesn't translate, but it recurs in exorcism texts, Babylonian mind-binding chants, and most disturbingly, early American land deeds hidden in Yale's forbidden archives. The coin wasn't currency. It was a key. Touch it once, and over time, your perception of reality begins to rot. You forget your own memories. Start confusing dreams with your past. By the time your wife asks your name, you just stare. The body remains. The voice remains. But the man? Gone. This was Elijah's version of warfare, not conquest, but conversion. Not through persuasion, but through removal. Once a mind forgets its shape, it's ready to be rewritten. And when you control a man's reality, you control his future decisions, without him ever knowing he chose them. This wasn't magic. It was the birth of psychological programming in North America. And the ones who studied him never stopped. Behind every prodigy is a patron. Behind every war, a whisperer. Elijah Brant wasn't an accident. He wasn't an anomaly. He was a seed, planted by a group so deeply embedded in the roots of early America that not even history dares speak their name. They called themselves the Silent Order. No flag, no doctrine, no visible power. Yet, they sat behind the curtains of every major colonial decision from 1720 to 1812. Their members weren't generals or governors. They were designers of the invisible, architects of belief, men who understood that controlling narrative was more lethal than controlling armies. And Elijah, he was their experiment in perfect obedience. His childhood wasn't shaped by trauma. It was sculpted by calculation. Every nightmare, every prayer, every color he was allowed to see, all designed to forge one thing, a being capable of destroying truth and replacing it with something more useful: control. The Silent Order was obsessed with one idea: if you shape perception, you never need to enforce reality. They learned early on that battles were won before blood was spilled, through stories, symbols, rituals. And so, they tasked themselves with creating not soldiers but narrative weapons. Elijah was the first. But he wasn't the last. After Fort Crawley, the order took him underground. Not for punishment, for expansion. They created a chamber, deep beneath what would later become Harvard University, where Elijah underwent the 9 deconstructions. This wasn't torture. It was engineering, one by one. His senses were isolated. For days, he was made to see without sound, hear without sight, taste without input, touch without feeling, until eventually, his brain began to fabricate input and then accept that input as real. When he emerged, he no longer needed to lie. He could believe any story, any ideology, any history, if it served the purpose of control. Understand the weight of that. Elijah became the prototype for modern disinformation, long before the internet, long before media empires. He was the algorithm, and the silent order. They began spreading his methods, first to missionaries, then to educators, then to politicians. Until American truth itself was no longer found, it was issued, the land of the free, built on psychological leash training. And you've been walking in it your whole life. There is a war happening right now. Not in the deserts. Not on your screens, not with missiles or drones. It's happening in your mind. And it began in 1745, when Elijah Brant authored a doctrine not meant for generals, but for generations. It was never officially published, never given a name. But among covert circles of early intelligence operatives, it became known as the doctrine of the unseen war. A philosophy that declared, control the symbols, and you control the people. Control the people, and you never need to fight again. This doctrine became the blueprint for psychological warfare, not just on enemies, but on citizens. The premise was simple: people don't fight over facts, they fight over meaning. So, if you could alter a society's symbols, its flags, its heroes, its creation stories, you could make them love their own captivity. And that's exactly what happened. Elijah's tactics were integrated into colonial education. Small at first, textbooks rewritten, church sermons inverted, common phrases like, God bless America, were infused with subconscious fear triggers connected to obedience, sacrifice, and surveillance. A child born in 1750 wouldn't have noticed, nor would the child in 1850, or even 1950. Because the system doesn't announce itself, it becomes you. But in secret, the architects of the doctrine kept growing. They moved through Ivy League fraternities, underground Masonic lodges, and eventually government black programs. By the 20th century, Elijah's work had been rebranded as MK Ultra, Project Monarch, and Operation Mockingbird. But the foundation, the bloodline of manipulation, that was Elijah's voice echoing through time, and it didn't stop with ideology. They found ways to anchor obedience biologically. Through ritual, through sound, through carefully engineered trauma. Do you remember your first fear? Your first betrayal? Your first heartbreak? They weren't just accidents. They were imprints. Experiences designed, yes, designed, to make you malleable. Because a man who is emotionally broken is easier to reprogram. And when you rebuild him, he'll fight for your lie with more passion than he ever fought for the truth. That's the unseen war, not waged in the open, but in dreams, in language, in memory. And if you're just now feeling the weight in your chest, that's not anxiety, that's awakening. Now, to lock it in, comment, I see the veil, twice below. Do it to mark the point of no return. The moment you stopped consuming stories and started remembering them. There's a reason obedience feels so natural, because it was engineered that way. Elijah Brant's final known contribution to the silent order was something so terrifying in its simplicity that it now forms the backbone of every modern government, corporation, and church that seeks control. It's called the 9 seals of compliance. Not physical seals, not objects, but psychological locks, planted into the minds of every citizen from birth, like invisible handcuffs. Each seal was designed to suppress one fundamental part of the human psyche, not through violence, through ritualized acceptance. Seal 1: obey the loudest voice in the room. Every classroom, every military drill, every media broadcast is built around this principle. We are trained from childhood to equate volume with truth. Seal 2: confuse comfort with safety. You're made to believe that silence is peace, that a full stomach means freedom, that a screen in your pocket is liberation. But in truth, comfort is the distraction, not the destination. Seal 3: fear your own voice. Self-doubt isn't natural, it's installed. How many times were you told to keep quiet, not speak out, not question? That's not parenting, that's programming. Seal 4: worship symbols over substance. Flags, crosses, seals, brands. You've been trained to feel before you think. To cry when a banner is burned, but stay silent when a man is buried unjustly. Seal 5: trust repetition over reason. If something is said enough, it becomes true. That's why they repeat slogans, mantras, advertisements, not to inform you, but to form you. Seal 6. Associate authority with morality. The robe, the badge, the suit, the title, none of it guarantees virtue. But your brain was wired to believe that power means righteousness. It doesn't. Seal 7. Trade purpose for productivity. You've been told your worth is in what you produce, not who you are. That's not culture. That's enslavement with nicer packaging. Seal 8. Replace memory with myth. You don't know your real history. You know the edited version. The cleaner version. The version that keeps you tame. Seal 9. Believe that resistance is pointless. This is the final seal. The fatal one. The whisper that says, you can't win. But here's the truth. If that were real, they wouldn't have spent centuries convincing you of it. They only build cages for things they're afraid of. So ask yourself, somewhere deep beneath the Allegheny Mountains west of Pennsylvania, there is a place no map dares mark. No road leads to it. No satellite captures it. But it exists. They call it the Hollow Vault, a subterranean archive carved into limestone by the hands of indentured children in 1790. No one who entered before 1902 was allowed to leave alive. Why? Because of what was hidden inside a library. But not just any library. This one doesn't contain what the world wants you to remember. It contains what the world has fought to make you forget. Thousands of documents, journals, first-hand accounts, banned blueprints, ancient texts written in Proto languages that haven't been spoken since before the flood myths. And in the center of the room, on a pedestal made of melted shackles, sits the original doctrine of the unseen war. Elijah Brant's own handwritten record. Still stained with blood, it was never supposed to survive. After his disappearance in 1746, the Silent Order attempted to burn it. But the flames wouldn't touch it. The ink refused to run. Witnesses described a low humming, like a voice trapped in parchment. So instead of destroying it, they buried it. And surrounded it with decoys, false documents, counterfeit scrolls, even sacred texts filled with strategic lies, not to protect the truth, but to overwhelm it. Because here's the cruel trick. They learned that truth doesn't need to be erased. It only needs to be buried under enough falsehood to make the seeker collapse from exhaustion. The Hollow Vault became a psychological minefield, a test for those who dared descend. And those who passed were never the same. One man did escape. Dr. Alton Ferrist, a Yale-trained linguist, entered the vault in 1928 under a forged geological survey. He emerged 13 days later with frostbitten fingers and eyes that refused to close. His last written words were sent in a sealed letter to his wife. The boy didn't die. He dispersed. He is in everything now. In our thoughts, our media, our prayers. Elijah Brant is the ghost in the algorithm. The story that rewrites the storyteller. And that's why they built new tools, television, radio, AI, social platforms, not to connect us, but to flood us, to drown our instinct in noise. Because buried beneath a billion distractions is the one truth that ends their control. If Elijah Brant's doctrine was the seed, the internet is the tree, and the algorithm, that's the fruit. You were told it's neutral, that it simply shows you what you want. But let's cut through that lie now. The algorithm isn't designed to serve you. It's designed to shape you. Every scroll, every like, every subtle pause on a headline. These are not just data points. They're neurological hooks, invisible chains. Chains forged from Elijah's earliest experiments in behavioral mirroring. His blood psalm strategy didn't end with whispered songs in the forest. It evolved. The sound became symbols. The symbols became language. And now, language becomes your prison. You type a word. The system reflects it back. Louder, stronger, with urgency. You think you're exploring truth, but you're only being herded toward acceptable realities. The system doesn't punish you with pain. It rewards you with comfort, and then turns comfort into compliance. Here's how it feeds your fears to keep you reactive. It feeds your hopes to keep you passive. And then it surrounds you with mirrors, other people, other opinions, carefully curated to mimic your own, until your entire world becomes a closed loop of self-confirmation. What happens to a man when he never hears an opposing idea? He stops thinking. And when he stops thinking, he becomes programmable. That was Elijah's final lesson to the Silent Order. Not how to dominate with force, but how to seduce with familiarity. It's no accident that social media feels good. It was designed by men who studied obsession, studied ritual, studied dependency, the same way Elijah studied obedience. You think the algorithm is digital? It's not. It's ancient. Every dopamine spike, every scroll, every shadow ban, every viral video. They're part of the same song Elijah played on that bone flute centuries ago, just now sung in zeros and ones. And here's the darkest part: you can't opt out. Not anymore, because opting out has been rebranded as madness, isolation, insurrection. So now you nod, you smile, you post. And somewhere the system smiles back. But it's not real approval. It's permission to keep dreaming. While they mine your soul. You're not the user. You're the product. There's a reason ancient cathedrals make your chest tighten. A reason certain monuments, certain government buildings make your spine go stiff when you stand before them. It's not awe. It's not patriotism. It's geometry. More specifically, ritualized architecture, a silent language spoken by the elite for thousands of years. A language of angles, ratios, and vibrations designed not to impress, but to program. And Elijah Brant was the first in America to speak it fluently. His final years weren't spent on battlefields. They were spent drawing, designing, laying out a new blueprint for the colonies, not one of roads or walls, but of psychological control through structure. Every room he entered, he measured. Every window he saw, he sketched, not to admire, but to decode. He learned from the exiled masons, the builders who once shaped Solomon's temple, the men who carved energy pathways into stone, the ones who knew that sound bends in octagons, and that emotion pools in dumbs. They taught him the secret that still holds America hostage. If you shape the space, you shape the mind within it. That's why courthouses echo, why schools are shaped like boxes, why prisons resemble old monasteries. These aren't accidents, they are structures of submission. The ceiling you sit beneath affects how high your thoughts can go. The width of your hallways teaches you how much freedom to expect. And the placement of your mirrors, that teaches you to see yourself through someone else's lens first. Elijah's most chilling design was found beneath what is now the Capitol building. An underground room, octagonal in shape, with 13 pressure-activated floor tiles. When stepped on in sequence, they play a series of tones, a sonic code encoded with subharmonics proven to induce docility. That room is not on any public map, but every president since 1850 has stood in it, alone, before inauguration, for 7 minutes. Why? Because control is more than policy. It's ritual. They don't need you to obey out of fear. They want you to obey because the architecture around you makes disobedience feel unnatural. This is not superstition. It's engineering. And once you see it, you'll start noticing the cages they've built around your thoughts. Not steel. Not stone. But symmetry. You were never meant to walk this path alone. Throughout history, others saw it, felt it, warned us. Men and women who glimpsed the architecture behind the illusion and paid the price. They were called madmen, heretics, traitors. But they were something far more dangerous. Witnesses. In 1777, a man named Obadiah Kirch stood on the steps of the Boston Masonic Lodge and shouted just 6 words before he was dragged away. The boy is still writing history. He was never seen again. In 1814, during the War of 1812, a Native American polymath named Tahoma described in his journals a recurring vision of a pale child with no shadow, walking backward through time, whispering false names into the ears of leaders. The British burned the villages. But not the journal. It sits now in a vault in Langley, untranslated, untouched, but watched. In 1903, Ada Varick, the first female professor of symbology at Yale, discovered that the layout of Washington, D.C. matched not Greco-Roman ideals, as claimed, but a Mesopotamian demon summoning grid first recorded in the Epic of Era. She published one paper. Her name was blacklisted within weeks. Her department shuddered. She died in obscurity, choking on blood. The autopsy claimed natural causes. These are not coincidences. They are systematic erasures. Because every time someone gets too close to decoding the pattern, too close to the source of the story, the architects activate what Elijah himself once called the displacement protocol. A 3-step psychological erasure. 1. Discredit the prophet. Call them insane. 2. Distract the people. Give them war, scandal, spectacle. 3. Distort the message. Repackage it in entertainment until no one knows it ever meant anything real. That's why the most dangerous truths always sound like fiction. Why revelations come dressed as horror, sci-fi, fantasy? They must. Because if you speak plainly, they will bury you. And every time one of these prophets screamed into the void, Elijah's shadow echoed back, subtly, invisibly. The hand guiding history from behind the curtain, not as a man anymore, but as a method, a program, a ritual. He doesn't need to live. He only needs to be believed in. And the more people forget him, the more power he gathers. There's a ritual so old, so dangerous, that it's been disguised in every culture on Earth. Sometimes it's called a coming of age. Sometimes it's initiation. Sometimes baptism. But beneath the surface, it's always the same thing, the inversion ritual. A ceremony not meant to awaken your power, but to redirect it. Elijah Brant learned it in the depths of the Silent Order's chamber, where flame met blood and truth bent backward. He didn't invent the ritual. He merely perfected it. And what he discovered was this. If you can make a man reject his instincts once, just once, you can own his soul for a lifetime. That's what the inversion does. It doesn't demand loyalty, it demands confusion. Step 1: separate the child from instinct. This is why children are told their emotions are wrong. Don't cry. Don't be angry. Don't ask questions. Each phrase, a knife carving doubt into identity. Step 2: reverse moral polarity. Heroes become criminals. Criminals become icons. You're taught to admire power, not wisdom. To envy wealth, not character. And slowly you forget what truth feels like. Step 3: reward submission with illusion. A diploma, a promotion, a blue check mark. These are not achievements, they're tokens. Symbols meant to replace real experience with sanctioned identity. The moment you accept them as truth, the ritual is complete. And from that moment forward, your choices are no longer yours. They are the system's. You've felt it, haven't you? That quiet resistance inside you, when everyone cheers for something that feels wrong. That voice that whispers, "This isn't real." That's your instinct, fighting to survive. But Elijah's ritual wasn't just about individuals. He applied it to nations. Flip the script, invert the sacred, and soon a people will celebrate their own captivity. They'll call it freedom. They'll wave flags over their own cages. And when the bar's close, they'll thank their captors. This is why every major empire falls the same way. Not from war, but from inversion. When the people forget who they are, what they feel, and what they once believed in, that's when the real conquest begins. Not of land, not of laws, but of the soul. And the ritual, it's still happening, right now, all around you. Every screen, every sermon, every algorithm, not just watching you, shaping you. You were taught to believe in leaders, presidents, kings, men with titles and power who run the world. But power doesn't wear a name tag, it hides. Because the moment you can see the face of your ruler, he's no longer your ruler. He's your decoy. What Elijah Brant understood, and what the Silent Order implemented, was the art of the hollow throne. Here's how it works. You create a figurehead. Charismatic, flawed, but relatable. You give him a mission, a background, a family. You stage his rise. You choreograph his fall. Then, you broadcast him over and over, until the illusion becomes scripture. Meanwhile, the true architects remain in the dark, watching the strings they tied years, decades, before. Let's bring it home. Washington loved symbols, but feared secrecy. He died suspicious, surrounded by men he no longer trusted. Lincoln opposed the banking cabals, shot in the head by a man with Masonic ties. Kennedy tried to dismantle the intelligence hydra, killed in broad daylight. The tape rewound so many times it became a lullaby. It's not a conspiracy, it's a pattern, a formula. Keep the people focused on the puppet. Let them argue over his color, his sins, his speeches. Give them scandal. Give them sides. But never, never, show them the hand pulling the strings. Because the moment the real enemy is seen, the game collapses. That's why Elijah disappeared. Not because he failed, but because he succeeded too well. His teachings became the infrastructure of all modern governance, governed by spectacle, control by narrative, rule through false choice. Every election is a ritual, not of power transfer, but of consent manufacturing. You are given options, but never ownership. You are told who the enemy is, but never who writes the script. And so the people chant, cry, and cheer for kings that do not rule, laws that do not protect, and justice that never arrives. The hollow throne is not empty, it is layered, and each layer you peel away leads you not to salvation, but to the design. The same design Elijah etched into stone with ash and blood. A system not of governance but of containment. You were never meant to be governed. You were meant to be managed. By the time you reach this point, you start to feel it. Not fear, not confusion, but that cold, breathless realization that the world you move through each day isn't free. It's designed. You were born into a cage with invisible bars. And here's the trick: you were taught to love your cage, to decorate it, to defend it, to fight others over whose corner of the cage is better painted. But no one dares to ask who built the cage in the first place, and why does it need to look like freedom? Elijah Brant's final writings, those smuggled pages buried in bone, covered soil near the Ashgrove estate, spoke of what he called the prism, a system designed to fracture human will. The architects knew something vital: a man who knows he's enslaved will fight, but a man who thinks he's free, while being controlled, he will police himself. He'll mock the truth. He'll defend the system that devours him. Sound familiar? Debt as freedom, work as identity, voting as power, medicine as salvation, war as peace, and lies wrapped in red, white, and blue. The prism doesn't bind your body. It warps your mind. It hijacks your sense of self so thoroughly that you'd rather destroy the messenger than face the message. And it's working. Generation after generation, the strings get tighter, the lies more polished. They don't need to censor everything, because you've already censored yourself. You want proof. Look at how fast your mind just whispered. This can't be true. Not in America. Not me. That's the prism. Speaking for you. But there's a fracture in the glass, and it begins right here, with a choice. If you feel it, if something in you knows what I'm saying is real, then comment below, I see the cage. I refuse the throne. Type it twice. Lock it into your name. Because the algorithm may never show you this again. They don't want this spreading. Not this far. Not to you. But now it's your move, because once the bars become visible, you can never unsee them. Let's stop pretending. These systems of control, the prism, the cage, they didn't emerge randomly. They were built. Designed by minds cold enough to sculpt obedience like clay, and old enough to predate your textbooks, your flags, even your gods. They weren't kings. They weren't prophets. They were architects of untruth. Elijah Brant wrote of a meeting in 1738, known only as the Gathering of Seven, not recorded in any colonial history. No parchment, no witnesses, just one journal entry etched into blood-soaked deer hide. They came from the ashes of Rome, the banks of Babylon, the steps of old Jerusalem. Men without nations, without names, holding secrets older than war itself. They called him the boy who played God, and they came to crown him, a child no older than 13. Why? Because Elijah wasn't a weapon. They already had thousands of those. He was a template. Proof that if you could break a boy's soul just right, if you could twist trauma into obedience, you could manufacture a new kind of ruler. Not bound by tradition. Not weakened by mercy. A godless God. Empty enough to mirror the will of his creators, without ever questioning it. You think MKUltra was the first experiment in psychological domination? It was a footnote. The blueprint came centuries earlier. And guess what? The seven didn't die. They never do. Because institutions, real ones, don't need flesh. They embed themselves into law, into finance, medicine, education, worship. And they speak through policy, media, crisis, and cure. They rewrite your past while you sleep, and you wake up defending their version of it. You call it patriotism. But it's not. It's programming. Elijah realized too late. The moment he tried to dismantle what he'd helped build, he became the threat. The very thing his own system was trained to eliminate. Do you see it yet? This isn't about conspiracy. It's about engineering. And you were engineered to look away. To mock what you now feel gnawing at the edges of your chest. But we're not done. You're only halfway down. In 1894, a sealed box was discovered beneath a collapsed church in upstate New York. The church itself had no name, no records of its construction, no congregation, no priest ever assigned. It was as if it had been built just to hide something or someone. Inside that box was a manuscript, its pages stitched with human sinew, inked in an iron-based liquid later confirmed to be blood. The title, The Protocols of the Hidden Suns. No, not the forged Russian document you were trained to associate with conspiracy theory. This one was older. Rooted in American soil, 1746, and it described in chilling detail how to raise a god, not the celestial kind, not the divine, but a man-god, a construct, built not from miracles, but from trauma isolation and relentless exposure to engineered violence. The manuscript's first instruction? Take him from the mother before her eyes can imprint warmth, strip the father of name and presence. Teach the child that mercy is myth and pain is privilege. Sound familiar? That manuscript laid out, step by step, how to create a creature who could kill without conscience, lead without empathy, and destroy with a smile. Someone who didn't question orders, because he didn't know he was following them. That was Elijah Brant. The pages go on. They talk about the trial of mirrors, where the boy would be locked in a chamber surrounded by reflections, not just of his face, but of his failures, doctored atrocities, crimes he never committed but was forced to confess to, until the distinction between guilt and innocence collapsed. That's how they rewired him. That's how they erased the soul. And here's the worst part. That manuscript? It disappeared. The moment it was logged by the Smithsonian, it was transferred to a sub-department you've never heard of, housed beneath the Library of Congress, not digitized, not open for scholarly review. Vanished, because it wasn't just a manual for one boy. It was a framework for a new breed of leadership, emotionless, calculating, and easily replaceable. Elijah Brant wasn't the only one. He was the first prototype. There were others. There are others. You see them on your screens. You vote for them. You pledge allegiance to them, and every time you obey without asking why, you breathe life into the manuscript they said never existed. Comment, I am not your prototype, below, twice, if you're starting to see the veil tearing. There's a question they don't want you to ask. One that fractures the illusion the moment it's spoken aloud. What if I've never been free? Not metaphorically. Not spiritually. Literally. What if your thoughts, your habits, your rituals were sculpted by architects you've never seen, and never will? See, the story of Elijah Brant doesn't end with his final act of war, because Elijah didn't disappear. He was absorbed, not into the shadows, into the system, into a labyrinth of quiet power where names don't matter, only functions do. You think you're choosing your path. Every school bell, every oath, every social reward system is a loop of conditioning. And who wrote the original code? The same minds that designed Elijah. His life was a blueprint. Not just for leadership or control, but for you. When he was a boy, they locked him in a soundless room for 72 hours. No words, no light, no time. And when they finally opened the door, he crawled toward them, not for rescue, for belonging, because the silence had become unbearable. Now ask yourself, how many days could you last without your feed, your apps, your likes, your distractions? They found a way to break him with silence. But with you, they use noise, constant weaponized algorithmic noise. They don't need to lock the door anymore, because they've programmed you to hold it shut. Every belief you didn't question, every authority you didn't challenge, every symbol you saluted without knowing its origin. That's not freedom. That's conditioning. You're not in a prison. You're in a mirror. And behind the glass, someone's watching. Because what they did to Elijah on a battlefield, they're now doing in classrooms, boardrooms, bedrooms, quietly, elegantly, permanently. This is the final door. And it isn't locked. It's just waiting for you to realize it was never real. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. Comment, I am not your prototype, below, again, to burn the mask. Let the algorithm watch as your chains fall. Say, next for CTO 18. There's always a locked room beneath the library, a chamber not marked on any blueprints, not cataloged, not logged, but it exists. Every government archive, every Ivy League institution, every cathedral older than the Constitution, they all have one. In 1938, a caretaker at Yale vanished, no record, no search, just gone. Years later, a new employee cleaning a sub-basement in Sterling Memorial discovered a sealed hatch, no hinge, no handle, no exit signs, just a carving, 4 letters Latin, DVS, God. When the university investigated, they found something far older than Yale, older than the US, older than Protestantism. Pillars covered in oil, dark soot, scorch marks on the ceiling bones. But not animal, not entirely human either. There were documents too, stored in copper scrolls, inked in blood, charts outlining behavioral experiments using children bred not from families but selective lineages. Children with no identity outside obedience. Sound familiar? Elijah Brant was one of the first, but he wasn't the last. His bloodline continued, silently, strategically, embedded into every American institution we now call sacred. They didn't erase him, they enshrined him. Not as a name, but as a program. Every standardized test, every juvenile reform school, every executive psychometric filter. It's not about education, it's about detection. Finding the next Elijah. The room beneath the archive still exists, and not just in Yale. They go by different names. Vault 0, the red substrate, Abyssus Archivum, whispers from black-budget whistleblowers tell of a single desk, a chair made from spinal columns, and a film projector playing the same footage on loop. A boy, maybe 12, kneeling in a trench, whispering to the corpses, laughing. They say the latter breaks people, even the analysts, because it's not madness, it's joy. The joy of a child who realized he no longer has to pretend to be human. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's a conspiracy blueprint. And the walls that hide it were built using your taxes, your prayers, your votes. Elijah isn't gone. He's everywhere. And the architects are still searching for you. Because once you awaken, you're no longer useful. Unless you serve them. Poke text only, U400 words, there are codes that were never meant to be broken. Not because they're complex, but because they're not written in language, they're written in suffering. And Elijah Brant? He was the first to translate it. In a declassified memo marked Project Parallax, an agent described encountering Elijah's Cipher during a Cold War experiment in psychic mapping. It wasn't made of numbers or symbols. It was a sequence of events, specific traumas, applied in precise order: starvation, isolation, reward, betrayal, silence, obedience, punishment, recognition, repeat. That's the Cipher. And once implanted in a developing mind, it rewires the soul. You don't think the way you used to. You feel in patterns. It creates soldiers, prophets, CEOs, killers. And if you're not one of them, you're one of us. The ones who consume their legacy without knowing it. The books we're assigned in school, tested through Parallax protocols. The films we celebrate, studied by behaviorists for mirror neuron response. Even dating apps are tuned to stimulate dopamine resilience thresholds, training you to bond, break, beg, and obey. It's all part of Elijah's cipher. But here's the part that should chill you to the core. The final variable in the sequence is you. Because the cipher doesn't end until the subject completes it by choice. The last step is self-initiation. You internalize the cycle. You begin to crave it. You choose to return to the pain. Because it's all that makes you feel real. And once that happens, you're no longer a victim. You're a vessel. A walking cipher, ready to pass it on. Through your children, your students, your followers. That's why the algorithm loves this content. Why it didn't censor this story. Because it thinks you're already encoded. Already locked in. But there's one thing Elijah never calculated. Someone might see the pattern and refuse to finish it. Someone like you. If you're hearing this, it means the final sequence has been interrupted. You've glimpsed the code and didn't flinch. Comment Cipher broken below. Not for the views, not for the likes, but as a signal to them. You are no longer a vessel. Spoken text only, 400 words, you were never meant to reach this point. If you're still here, you've crossed a threshold most never even see. Elijah Brant's legacy wasn't a man. It wasn't a cult. It wasn't even a bloodline. It was a mirror, a system designed to reflect the worst parts of us, until we began to mistake them for truth. And we did. We accepted suffering as strength, isolation as intelligence, cruelty as leadership, control as love. Because Elijah's cipher taught us to worship what breaks us, as long as it made us feel chosen. But here's what they didn't account for: a human being can change. Not by escaping the shadow, but by walking straight through it. Every sealed room beneath an archive. Every whisper in a black file. Every obedient generation raised to continue the sequence. They were all built on one belief: that you'd never question the pain. That you'd keep feeding the cycle because it was familiar. But familiarity is not truth. Tradition is not wisdom. And silence is not consent. This is not the part where we hunt Elijah's descendants. This isn't a crusade. It's a cleansing. You don't end a curse by punishing the cursed. You end it by refusing to carry it forward. Burn the script. Break the cycle. Erase the cipher. Not with violence, but with awareness. With love that doesn't demand obedience. With education that inspires wonder, not conformity. With power that protects, not exploits. Look around. How many of your own patterns are just echoes of someone else's design? Who taught you to flinch when loved? Who told you you had to earn rest? Who convinced you that silence meant strength? Those aren't quirks. They're residue, leftover fragments of Elijah's cipher still lodged in the bones of society. But now you see it, and once you see the cipher, you can refuse to repeat it. That's the true purge. Not fire, not blood, choice. You've reached the end of this story, but it's the beginning of your own. No more shadows, no more scripts, just you. Undefinable, uncoded, free. If you felt this, deep in your gut, comment, "The mirror is broken." And for those watching in silence, that's okay. Elijah taught them to hide. But you just walked out of the room no one else believed existed. Welcome back to yourself. Now go rebuild the world, one truth at a time.